But the topic of the day is baseball. And be honest, I'm a little surprised that we've got the audience that we do. The Cats, several years ago, playing on the north side had generated a lot of interest, but they haven't played in a while. And so to see this crowd and to see who we have on the Zoom, I'm excited to see that. To me, nobody represents Fort Worth like the Cats. And I've done, obviously, a lot of research. And during that research, I've met a lot of neat people. And one of the gentlemen that's here today, I haven't seen in a long time, actually helped me with a lot of research. And I want to say thank you, Max Hill. When he worked at the library, we did a lot, going through all kinds of different archives. And I can't tell you anybody more helpful than Max was in a lot of those early days back way back when. So I'm going to try to do this presentation with some photo slides I have, just to kind of give you versus me just standing up here talking for 30 minutes. So we're going to see how that works with this Zoom. I will say that there's also going to be some terminology that I'm going to use that I want to clarify. So there's a big difference between professional baseball and semi-professional baseball. Professional baseball, all the players are contracted to play baseball. They don't have, it's not a part-time job, it's a full-time job. So that's professional baseball. Semi-pro, they typically have a real job, and then they'll go on the weekends or go in the evenings and play and then get a percentage of the gate. That's semi-pro. What we're going to talk about today is professional baseball in Fort Worth. The second concept is this one called independent baseball versus affiliated baseball. So independent baseball means that the player contracts, there's typically local ownership, and all the player contracts are owned by that local ownership. Affiliated baseball means that there could be local ownership, or in most cases, the major league team owns that team, but all the player contracts are with the major league team. And so the process is for them to move up the ladder of the different minor leagues till they hopefully get a chance to play in major leagues. The early part, and I say this because the early part of the Cats were all independent teams, and then after the war, World War II, they became an affiliate of the Brooklyn Dodgers. And we'll talk a lot about that as well. But I wanted to make sure that everybody understood those differences. So with that said, let's start in Texas in the 1870s. There was no professional baseball in Texas, obviously, but baseball was being played. I think the first recorded game happened in 1870 down in Brownsville, Texas, between military personnel, and it was the Robert E. Lees versus the Ulysses S. Grants. And I will tell you that Grant won again. There was so much excitement over just that one game that they started playing exhibition games in Galveston. And then some very entrepreneurial type folks would, yes ma'am?
I'm just going to angle this a little differently.
I can move.
There we go. That's a lot better. You had the screen was in the camera.
Okay. Gotcha. So, technical. But back to, so these entrepreneurial type folks would put together these barnstorming teams. And barnstormers are basically during the off season, fall, winter, spring, early spring, they would put together like little all-star teams, and they'd go around all over the country that didn't have baseball, and they'd play for the gate, for people's attendance. They'd make a big deal, advertise it, and then go play and make money. Well, several folks found that when they came to Texas to barnstorm, they were making a lot of money. They basically had an interest here. So in 1888, a guy named Big John McCloskey decided to start what we now know as the Texas League. And Fort Worth had an entry in the very first 1888 league. Our ownership was a guy named Bill Ward, who also happened to be a proprietary in Fort Worth. In fact, his little business was the White Elephant Saloon. So the owner of the White Elephant Saloon was the first owner of the Fort Worth Cats, or Fort Worth Panthers. And by the way, I need a little clarification there. They were known as the Panthers early in their concept because of the story behind the panther sleeping on the town square, and I don't think I have to tell y'all that. And they didn't really switch officially to the Cats until the mid-1930s. But they were referred to as the Cats all through the 20s and on, then they kind of really adopted the Cats name. But so the first start of the Texas League was hit and miss. They played in 1888 and 1899. They didn't play in 90, 91. They started getting 92, off in 93. They came back in 94, 95, off again 96, or they played 96, off again 97 through 1900, where they were just only a South Texas League. And then they came back strong in 1903. But during that time, when they had a league, Fort Worth pretty much had an entry in it, as all did all the big cities, San Antonio, Houston, Galveston, which in those days was huge. And so the travel, so let's imagine two things. One, how is the Fort Worth Cats going to get to Houston to play a ball game? Train, right? So they'd haul on a train for 8 hours or whatever it took, and then try to play a ball game that night. So scheduling and getting teams moved around was a real problem, and that's why you had the fits and starts of the Texas League. But now let's imagine all of us in 1895 going to a ball game. We'd either get on a horse, get a buggy. So there wasn't such thing as parking lots. You had to make sure that you had a livery stable nearby so that you could basically go and watch the ball game. So it was a very slow-moving country affair, small crowds, but it survived. And the first championship team in Fort Worth was in 1895. I want y'all to pay particular attention to not only the uniforms, but look at their shoes. Everybody see that? 1895, there was actually I'll try to move these around a little bit. The 1895 team, there was actually some question about who actually won it, and they finally worked it out, and the Fort Worth Cats were awarded the championship because back then, even the championship series, which today we know as a World Series, is a 7-game series. Back then, they were playing as much as 12, 13, 14 games because they thought that they could make more money during the championship games. And there was times where, like Dallas, being Dallas, would say, well, they've already beat us 6 times, we're not playing anymore. Or we beat them 4 times, we're not playing anymore. And everybody saying, wait a minute, we got 4 more games to go. So anyway, it was hit or miss in those early years. 1903 is really the key year for Fort Worth and the Texas League. From 1903 even to existence today, the Texas League was a stable league and survived all the economic issues that went with it. And Fort Worth has had an entry in that league from 63 to 57, and then 1 year in 64. But so the next champion in Fort Worth happened in 1904. And the 1904 team was a little special because several of these players that played during the season with the Cats actually became firemen during the off season. And one of them, after quit playing, and my mind went blank, but he became a fire chief in Fort Worth. Now the other thing that happened in 1903 was most of you historians remember the North Texas Traction Company. And the North Texas so I should have said the early years, those 1888 years, the Panthers would play at a field in what we all know as the T&P Reservation. So it's the area between Jennings and Maine, Vickery, and Lancaster. And as y'all know, it's a big rail yard. They had a lot of space, and they typically would find a a place to play in there. In 1888, there was actually a grandstand built. But in 1889, because Fort Worth thought the Spring Palace was more important, they actually tore that down to build the Spring Palace, which burned to the ground in 1990. So this was actually the very first stadium built of what I would call of consequence. It was called Haynes Park, and the field faced to the northwest. And so what you're seeing are in the background, some of the buildings are downtown. The Haynes Park location, which if y'all go out today and you see the big bus barn for our bus system, the lot to the south of that is where this park was located. Then a very industrial, baseball-driven young man at the time by the name of J. Walter Morris bought the Cats in 1910. And the first thing he did was move to the north side. Why was that important? Because also in 1903, the Swift Armor meatpacking plants moved to the stockyards, and so all the population growth was on the north side. And so he said, why am I lingering here on the south side? I need to be on the north side where all the people are. So in 1910, he built a park that originally became known as Morris Park, named after J. Walter Morris. And a few years later, he sold to Frank Weaver, and Frank, from Waxahachie, by the way, and Frank changed the name to Panther Park. So this was the first Panther Park. It's actually located between the same 6th and 7th streets on the north side of downtown, but on the west side of Main. So this was tucked into the levee on the west side. For those on Zoom, when I keep walking off, I'm putting these on an easel over here beside me. Sorry you can't continue to look at these. Now, this brought in the biggest era in the history of Fort Worth baseball. If you go to the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York, there are 2 minor league teams featured, and they have both played in the same era. One is at the time, International League Baltimore Orioles, who won the International League from 1919 to 1926, and your own Fort Worth Panthers, who won the Texas League from 1920 to 1925. And so those 2 teams actually have a little window on a wall in Cooperstown because of that longevity. And this is basically what put Fort Worth baseball on the map. Guys like Ziggy Sears, and Ed Konechny, and Clarence Craft. And by the way, Clarence Craft, who was the big hitter for 4 of those years, from 20 to 24, became a county judge. And right across the street, actually right here behind us, he had a Ford dealership, Craft Motors. So it's not only did he do well for Fort Worth, he made Fort Worth his home. And his granddaughter is actually making cakes up in Keller. So we've had a chance to talk quite a bit. But these teams were pretty amazing. And in fact, they were so good at the time that the owner, which by this time is W.K. Stripling Cox Stores, and his business manager was a guy named Paul LaGrave. Now, it was still named Panther Park at that time, but they had so much success that in 1920 they started a program where they would play the champion of the Southern League. So the Southern League was Mobile and Birmingham and Nashville, and that became known as the Dixie Series. And the Dixie Series was such a big part of baseball in that era that the attendance was out 15, 16, 17,000 people would go to the Dixie Series. I mean, it was very well covered. Amon Carter, here in Fort Worth would sponsor a special train called the Dixie Series Special so that he could take Fort Worthians to wherever southern city they were to watch that series. Now, because of all that success, and because Panther Park, built on the west side of Maine, was showing its age, W.K. Stripling and Paul LaGrave went across the other side of Main Street on the east side, purchased 5 acres, and built what we now know as the location for LaGrave Field, except it was still, excuse me, it was Panther Park at the time, but in 1929, Paul LaGrave fell ill and passed. And W.K. Stripling did 2 things. One, he renamed the field LaGrave Field, which is what we've known it since then. But number 2, he decided without Paul LaGrave, I no longer want to own the Fort Worth Cats. It's not, he's the reason why I participated. So all through the 30s in the Depression era, he sold to basically a collection of different people, different times, as kind of a stock ownership group. So quite a few business people participated through those times. I don't think y'all would recognize some of the names, plus I couldn't remember them. This is also, though, in the 30s, and they won the pennant, they won the Texas League pennant in 1930, but this is when they also transformed themselves from the Panthers, and so the newspapers would reference them as the Cats, because, right, it's less printing Cats versus Panthers. But this is when they finally adopted the Cats logo. As you can see that on the jersey. So pretty much from this point on, they were known as the Fort Worth Cats, which we know today. Now, these next set of slides I'm going to show actually kind of show some of the personalities that we have had come through Fort Worth. Probably the first big name ball player that played here was a guy named Hank Greenberg, who y'all know that went on to Hall of Fame status through the Detroit Tigers. He played here in 1935. And because they were trying to drum up all kind of interest during the Depression, in 1935 the Cats wore green jerseys. Wish I had one, but some of the old photos they look black in the black and white photos, but they were green. But one of the greatest hitters in the history of baseball, the greatest right-handed hitter, does anybody know who that is? He was actually from Texas, Rogers Hornsby. Rogers Hornsby had a lifetime, listen to this, lifetime 424 average. That's unheard of today. Well, he was the manager in 1942. Now I'm going to borrow, I set this down here, but I'll borrow it real quick. But as you know, in 1942, we entered the war, and so Roger and the Cats did their part to help sell war bonds. And this was a big deal during the 1942 season. And that right there is Rogers. So from 1943 through 1945, for obvious reasons, there pretty much was no minor league baseball. I think the International League played or tried to play a couple seasons, but even all of the major leaguers, most of the major leaguers were off fighting the war as well. And so there was a lot of, if you could not muster or passed the test to be in the service, then you played. And so the Major League Baseball, the commissioner and the president decided we needed to keep it going as a distraction from the war for folks. So the Major League Baseball played, but the minor league baseball did not. And so when they came back in 1946, this is when a whole new era of actually all of minor league baseball started. So up until that time, as I mentioned earlier, most teams were independent. That means the contracts of the players were held by the local ownership. Well, the local ownership also knew that some of these players were well worth the money, and they were selling those players to the major league clubs for a pretty good profit. Well, the major league clubs said, hey, why are we paying these exorbitant prices for these players? Why don't we do our own farm system? And a guy named Branch Rickey was the one that actually started that, and the very first team owned by a major league club was the Houston Buffaloes, who played in this league, and they were bought by the St. Louis Cardinals, which Branch Rickey was the general manager of. So that started kind of proliferating a little bit through the minor leagues, but after the war, they basically all got together and said, we're going to do it all the way. There's not going to be any independent baseball. Now, there's a few exceptions, Dallas being one. George Sheps, who owned the Dallas team, Sheps Dairy, he refused to be affiliated, and so he still ran as an independent. But for the most part, across the nation, most of the teams became an affiliate, and because of that, you know, the players were supplied by the major league team. Well, the Fort Worth was lucky enough to have their relationship with the Brooklyn Dodgers. And so in 1946, their center fielder was a young man by the name of Edwin Snyder. And y'all might know him as Duke Snyder. Duke had an illustrious history with the Brooklyn Dodgers, and obviously in the Hall of Fame. And I got to tell you, I got to meet him before he unfortunately passed. He is a super, super individual. Told some unbelievable stories. Now, one of the other characters of Fort Worth came to Fort Worth in 1949, and he was a backup catcher for the Brooklyn Dodgers, and basically was told by Brooklyn that his catching skills and his hitting skills weren't quite major league material, but they think he would make a good manager. So in 1949, the Brooklyn Dodgers sent Bobby Bragan down to Fort Worth to become their manager, which he did up through the next 5 years through 1953. And as y'all know, Bobby ended up making Fort Worth his home. He eventually became the president of the Texas League. His funeral over here south of us was attended by probably 6,000 people. It was amazing. He was well loved and did a lot for Fort Worth. And today, his Bobby Bragan Youth Foundation is still providing for scholarships for deserving young people. And just to show y'all what things were like in 1949 versus today, this is a picture of the dugout at LaGrave Field. It's not as big and luxurious as some of the dugouts that we see today in Major League Baseball. Now, in one of the stories that I was able to get, because one of the other players that played here was a left-handed pitcher that actually helped Brooklyn win the 1955 World Series by the name of Carl Erskine. So one of the fun research pieces I would do was to write these former players and say, hey, tell me some story about playing at Fort Worth. And Carl has one of the funniest. He said that it was second night, and I had just pitched opening night and won, and so I wasn't expected to do anything, and had a jacket on and was sitting in the dugout. Well, we got in the ninth inning in a tie game, and Bobby had walked. And Bobby was known as one of the slowest. Bobby was a player manager, for those that know what that is. Bobby had walked, he was known as one of the slowest people in baseball, so he called me in to go run for him. So I was eating peanuts, I spit all them out and took my jacket off and tried to loosen up and went running into the game. And the first thing Bobby told me, he said, "Hey, this lefty's got a really tricky move, don't get picked off." So I took my lead, and the first pitch, he picked me off. Bobby didn't speak to me for a week. So that was a Carl Erskine story. Well, later, in 1949, something else happened that was devastating to Fort Worth, and that is our lovely LaGrave Field burned to the ground. And this happened in the 1st of May. And if you notice, though, around the stadium, what do y'all see? 10 days after it flooded. So fire and flood hit LaGrave Field all within a 10-day span. And luckily, they were expected to go on a big road trip for the next 10 days, and so they played one game, a Sunday game, with the smoldering fire, and then while they were gone, they were able to clean up enough of the stands to at least come back and play, even though there wasn't a whole lot of seating available. Now, one of the other players who played here 54 through 56 was a guy named Dick Williams. I'm going to show you two folks here real special. Dick Williams had a very average career, but as we all know, he became an excellent manager. And he managed the San Diego Padres to the World Series in 1984. Well, the team they played was the Detroit Tigers in 1984. Does anybody know who the manager of the Detroit Tigers was? We knew him then as George Anderson, and George Sparky Anderson was the manager of the Detroit Tigers in 1984. So if I can put these two together, these teammates on the 1955 club managed against each other in the 1984 World Series. Quite the story that nobody told, right? Now, anybody want to guess who the first African American to play in Fort Worth was? Y'all might have heard of him. His name was Maury Wells. Actually, Brooklyn sent two. The other guy on the other side is named Eddie Moore. But Eddie just decided he didn't want to play. So he came down, suited up for 2 or 3 games, and left. But Maury stayed. I've talked to Maury a lot, and there's been different stories written about his stay here, because as y'all know, Fort Worth has had a history, but he said he was treated very well. He actually stayed in a apartment loft above the TMP railroad deal, and Danny Ozark, who was his teammate, would swoop by in a car and pick him up and take him to the ballpark every day. And by the way, Maury Wells, who, when he came here in 55, Al Vincent was the manager, so did not know Bobby Bragan, but had moved his way up to AAA Spokane, and his manager in AAA Spokane was Bobby Bragan. And he credits Bobby 100% for, number one, turning him on the left side of the plate, teaching him how to bunt and run. And that's how Maury Wells became the ball player he was. How we doing on time? Okay. So I don't have any slides during this time period, but shortly after this period in 1956, several things happened on the big landscape of baseball. Number one, there was this huge Western movement. The New York Giants left New York to go to San Francisco, and the Brooklyn Dodgers left Brooklyn to become the Los Angeles Dodgers. Now, in those days, teams they basically owned territories. So the Chicago Cubs owned the territory of Los Angeles. So in order for Brooklyn to go to play in Los Angeles, they had to work out an arrangement with Chicago. And what they did is they traded the St. Paul Club and the Fort Worth Club to Chicago in order to play in Los Angeles. And so from 57, actually up through 59, Fort Worth was a Chicago Cubs franchise. And several Cubs, including Ernie Banks, played here in Fort Worth. And then the second thing that happened, which a lot of people don't know, and I didn't include this slide, but I should have, there was a move to expand Major League Baseball. Houston wanted a team in Major League Baseball. Minneapolis wanted a team in baseball. Several others, Washington, who lost their team to Minnesota at one time, they all wanted to expand in Major League Baseball, wouldn't do it. So Branch Rickey, again, tried to start this Continental Baseball League. Southern Anaheim, California Angels, they wanted a team. And so this Continental Baseball League, they basically went to these bigger cities that didn't have baseball, and they started actually getting momentum. Well, he came to Dallas-Fort Worth and said, look, the only way that y'all are going to get a major league team is if y'all work together. And so I'm going to show, I do have that one. So in that time frame, the Major League Baseball saw what was happening, saw the energy, and finally acquiesced and said, okay, we got to expand. And they did. They expanded into Anaheim and Minneapolis and can't remember some of the other cities, but they did that. So they basically killed the Continental League. But it didn't kill momentum in Fort Worth and Dallas to continue as a joint venture. So basically from 60, 61, 62, and 63, Dallas and Fort Worth played together as the DFW Rangers. And they would play a series here in Fort Worth and a series in Dallas. The Dallas attendance over those years became more and more, so they'd play a lot more in Dallas and a lot less here in Fort Worth. And then in 64, Fort Worth said, look, this isn't working, we want to have our own team. And so if you see on the little memorabilia, please, that the blue cat's ears, that's from 1964. And they basically said, hey, the Cats are back. We're going to play at LaGray Field and come back and try to make a go of it. It didn't work. Financially just wasn't something in the cards. And so in 1965, everything merged again. They built a stadium in Arlington. They became the DFW Spurs. And that's also how Arlington Stadium got built. The one that eventually they would expand to let the Washington Senators come down here and become the Texas Rangers in 1972. So that's pretty much the history of professional baseball in this area, except till 2002. And in 2002, Carl Bell, who I give a lot of credit for, and a couple others decided it was time to bring Fort Worth professional baseball back to Fort Worth. And so the very first year they played in the All-American Association, and the games were played on the south side of town. Just forgot the little ballpark, but it's the high school field that's there by pretty close to the Tarrant County College on the south side. And in 2003, they built what we've now become LaGray Field. That is still there today. And in 05, 6, and 7, the Cats won the All-American Association and the Independent Baseball Championships for the leagues that they were in, because it was Central Baseball League, and then it switched to the American Association. They won those championships, and one of the rings. So in your case that you saw over there, I have a ring from the 1948 championship team, which was the last Texas League championship that Fort Worth had, and the 05 ring from the Central Baseball League championship, which is when they won again. So those are fun to look at. Now, with that done, they played independent baseball here up until 2015 was the last year. And then economics, the whole premise of the field, just it's hard in minor league baseball when the minor league baseball team owns the ballpark. Because by the time they get through paying property taxes on that ballpark, there's just not a lot of money left over to do anything else with. And so that's why if you look around the nation, most of these ballparks are in some kind of public-private partnerships of some kind. Well, that never happened here in Fort Worth. And so there's been some small attempts to try to revive LaGrave Field and bring a team back, but right now nothing's been successful. But I'm hoping that an interest from folks like yourselves, maybe we can make that happen. Because it was, at one time, a marketing guy told me, he says, you know, in 05 and 06, there were 3,000 people going to a Cats game. That was the biggest event in Fort Worth at that time. And they were doing it every weekend. So I know there's a yearning for it. I also believe that professional sports is a great ambassador for a city. You know, if you think about it, when the Fort Worth Cats were playing all over Texas and wherever they played, Fort Worth was in the box score. Fort Worth was in the newspaper. Fort Worth was being advertised. And so you lose that when you don't have professional sports. That's about all I have. Are there any questions? Yes, ma'am.
There were two guys from the 50s, one of the 50s teams, that used to come to the games and bring the last games.
Carol Behringer,
No?
Mike Napoli,
Yes,
yes, and Jack Lindsay.
yes. Are they still around?
So Jack is. Actually, at one time there were three of them. Carol was the other one. And Carol, I became really good friends with Carol Behringer. And he pitched on that 49 team all the way through till 56, or 56. Made Fort Worth his home. Did a lot for Texas Wesleyan University, and he was the first to pass. And then Mike passed probably 3 years ago.
The last two were just delightful.
Oh, you would have loved Carol too. No, they were fun to be around, fun to hear their stories. Yeah, I agree. Yes, sir.
When did you become interested in the Cats?
Well, so I've always loved Fort Worth. I was born here. Had a chance, when I left, I'm also an Aggie, so I have an engineering degree from A&M, and my first job was with IBM in Manassas, Virginia. And shortly up there, they had a group, which a lot of people have heard about, called SABRE. It's a Society for American Baseball Research. And I met a couple friends, and they were part SABRE members, and said, hey, why don't you join up? I said, okay. Well, when you fill out this entry blank, or the application to join, they ask you what's your specialty. Well, I didn't have one. And so, but Fort Worth, baseball, it meant the Cats. So then I decided if I'm gonna write that down, I need to know something about it. So I went head first and research and books and everything else. So, and I'm glad I did, because it's been great. And I get to do this, which is a lot of fun. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so this is kind of an esoteric question, but I wonder what your thoughts are on why it is that baseball seems to have really kind of stuck the landing as being America's national sport as opposed to any other sport, both historically and today. I mean, nowadays, football, I think, has larger viewership, but baseball is still kind of viewed as the national sport. And when you think of all the other opportunities, I mean, in the very beginning, historically, there would have been like, foot races and, horse races and bicycle races and, and then baseball comes along. And then there's other things like basketball or football, but baseball just kind of sticks it. And even though, like in the early 20th century, when you were recounting how many teams, grew and it folded like year after year, and despite economic difficulties, people still wanted baseball teams. Like, why do you think that is?
Well, so this is a very esoteric question. That's okay. No, I think it's one that needs to be asked. So here's a great example. Minor league baseball, I'm going to approach this from the historical perspective, was huge up until 1956. Two things happened in 1956. Anyone care to guess what those were? One was television, and the other one was air conditioning. So now everyone's got a television, no one's got air conditioning. Well, it was something that took away our attention. See, at the bottom line, my wife and I were actually part owners of the Cats, and so until you see the business side of that, some of this doesn't make sense. But if you look at it in generic terms, all of them, NFL, Major League Baseball, they're all entertainment. So basically, you're competing for entertainment dollars. Would you rather go to a movie, or would you rather go to a ball game? Would you rather go surfing, or would you rather go to a ball game? So you have to compete with those kinds of venues. Today, the attendance and viewership of baseball is way down. Baseball is not, today I think we have too many younger folks, and this is what scares me most about baseball. They want instant gratification. They want something exciting. They want something now, don't want to wait. Well, that's not baseball. Baseball is 9 innings. There is no clock. George Carlin, and I don't know all of them, but he did a great skit or skit on between football and baseball. He says, in baseball, you have fields and parks. In football, you got Soldier Field, and and he went down this list, and it's like it's gridiron, and baseball's calming, soothing. You got 9 innings, no matter if it takes 2 hours, if it takes 4 hours, you got 9 innings. That's not today's mantra. That's not the society today. So it's going to struggle. Now, with that said, there's still enough of us, I'm going to put me in that class, these old farts that really enjoy watching that. There's still enough excitement in the game. Here's what scares me even more. This has become so much more about money. It's like when I was really into baseball, I could tell you 5 or 6, 7 players that I would do anything I could go watch them. I wanted to see Nolan Ryan. I wanted to see Cal Ripken. I wanted to see Eddie Murray. I wanted to see, Maddox. I wanted to see these superstars because they were so good at their craft. Think about it today. How many of those folks would you go see? How many of y'all would pay? And by the way, seat prices went from $12 and $20 to $80 and $90. It's a family of 4. I saw one deal family of 4 used to be $60. Now it's $220. For a baseball game. And I'm like, man, you're so pricing yourself out of these crews. So I think it has a lot to do with the dynamics of society, but there's still an old guard that understands the greatness of baseball. Because one thing, since 1890, the bases are still 90 feet, pitchers still throw from 60 feet 6 inches. The game hasn't changed. And you can't say that about all these other sports. Is that close?
Well, I'm just wondering, why you think it like, why do you love baseball? Why do people, like, what is it about baseball compared to other sports that has made it such an, like, American iconic sport?
Well, there's so much going on in a baseball game that a lot of people don't understand, and I'll use this thing. So, catcher, pitcher. Ricky Henderson's on first base. So I've got to call a pitch that the hitter can't hit, that the catcher, if it gets by him or gets by the hitter, I could use to catch easily and throw Ricky Henderson out. So I'm going through a whole bunch of calculations. I got to move my shortstop over because I've decided to take this right-handed hitter and move him out and pitch him outside. I got to move my center fielder over a few more steps. All that's going on before a single pitch is thrown. I love that. It's a chess game. And I can see that. My son was lucky enough to play college baseball. My daughter actually played college softball. And even in both of them, you can see that going on every single play. And you don't get that. There was a play that Pudge Rodriguez did one time. My son, and I just couldn't believe it. He was catching. He was probably 12, 13 years old. We went to the Ranger game, sat behind home plate, and there was a runner on third base. Well, Pudge would catch the ball, and the first thing he did was look behind the batter to look down at third base. Why did he do that? Because he didn't want to catch the ball, throw it back, and all of a sudden that runner break and try to steal. And so that goes on and if you're not, if you're really a baseball person, you're into that and watch that, then it's a lot more exciting than what it looks like on TV when you just 3 up, 3 down. By the way, anybody know how many outs are in an inning?
6.
It's kind of a trick question. Most people say 3, but there's actually 6, both sides. So you just, that's why I like baseball.
I just wanted to point out that we have several questions in the chat.
Okay.
So you might want to pull those up. After the 1949 flood and fire, when did the next stadium get built at LaGray Field? Great question. So there was a question right after that they would actually not rebuild LaGray Field, but the Brooklyn Dodgers said, hey, this is too good of a position. We're very well located. So they built the first stadium. It's a steel and concrete stadium, but it had its own press box area for television. They actually put a platform out in front that the games could be televised because television was growing, and WBAP was the first to televise a game in 1950 from LaGray Field. So great question. And by the way, that stadium was torn down in 1965. Let's see. How do I go to the next question? I think you just scroll up or down.
Oh, that might be, okay, it's already at the bottom, so I need to go up. My cursor's, there it goes.
It's actually a touch screen.
Is it possible to find team pictures from about 1908 to 1917? My second great uncle, William Atlas, played ball here during some of those years. He usually played catcher, but sometimes outfielder. So I actually have a real good picture of the 1909 team, but there was no Bill Atlas on that. I didn't bring it with me, but I have a reference guide that shows all the players that played in the Texas League. If you want to research that more closely, go to your library and find the old Spalding or Reach guides, and they would be printed the year after. So all the statistics for every player that ever played, and that's another, back to your esoteric question, statistics in baseball are tracked to the nth degree. And so people get in, there's a whole group of folks called sabermetricians. That's all they do is track stats and how people are doing it. But to answer about your uncle, you can look at those guides and look for his name, and hopefully you'll find out his whole career.
But I also will tell you that, and not to throw cold water on your question, but I have had in the past a lot of questions like this, and 9 times out of 10, great uncle kind of exaggerated his playing skills and where he played. So, but I think it's worth the research because there are a few. I actually could probably answer this first one, just seeing the bottom of it here. Oh, so I have a friend, a really, really good friend who's on the call here. And actually I wanted to mention that to him because when I told him that, or when I mentioned earlier that Bill Ward owned the White Elephant Saloon, I know of a guy who owned the White Elephant Saloon that was in the stockyards. And I can't, you know, if he could have, he would have owned the team, and because he was such a baseball nut. But Joe Dooley's on this call, and Joe Dooley is a baseball icon. I love him to death. Him and Buddy Thomas would tell me stories about all the games they would go through to in the late 40s and 50s, and then they traveled. I got to give them also props. They would travel the country together, visiting every major league park they could. So Joe, hello, sir, and thanks for the question.
Linda provided a quick addendum to the previous question about the baseball stats. The Spalding Guide is apparently available at the Library of Congress website, digitized, so you can take a look at it right there online.
There you go. Did y'all hear that? So the Spalding Guide is available online through the Library of Congress, and you can peruse through all. Now, I'm going to warn you, there's 200 pages of stats because they do all the minor leagues, and but you could go to the very first page. I'm going this my mind of that league, and just go through, and they'll like do batting stats, and then you can go through and look through all the first 2 pages of that and see if you can find your uncle. Yes.
I know in the first part of the century there was an African American team called the Fort Worth Black Panthers. Was there ever any correlation between the 2 organizations?
So no, but I'm glad you asked that question because I have tried to do a lot of research on black baseball in Fort Worth. The very first team was called the Fort Worth Wonders. And they actually played in an area we call the Trinity Bottoms. So there was a park down there named after Douglas, Frederick Douglas Park, and so they would play their games in that area, and that was from the 1800s up until early 1900s. And then another saloon owner by the name of Hiram McGar took, when the Wonders League, which was the Texas Black Baseball League, folded, he tried to resurrect the league, and that's when the Fort Worth Black Panthers. The only correlation was they would sometimes play their games at Panther Park when the other minor league team was gone. So, and then when they were trying to play at the same time, they would have to find fields all over. Butts Park was available at one time, which was actually on Main Street briefly, and then they would find some smaller parks like Zebo's Park, not Zebo's, what's the one off of Rosedale and west of Wesleyan University? But that park, they would play there as well.
Do you remember what your first item, memorabilia item was that you collected?
Ooh.
Cats.
You know, not specifically. I will tell you, I have probably 1,000 items. I do know one of the first, and I can't remember where I found it, was a blue tie with the 1949 Cats logo at the bottom of it in yellow. I still have it, and I should have brought that, but no, but it's been fun. One of the things about collecting memorabilia like that I've had such an experience and fun over is sharing it. I probably have had exhibits in 12, 15 museums throughout Texas, from Corpus Christi to the Fielder Museum in Arlington, and about Stockyard, well, I still have some stuff at Stockyards, yeah, thank you. One of the fun ones was about, I'm trying to think of, maybe it was '09, where the Bob Bullock Museum in Austin did this big exhibit for almost a year called Play Ball Texas. And I probably had 600 items in there. I have a lot of jerseys that, so the Cats are obviously my favorite focus, but one of the things that I've done is extend it to all of professional baseball in Texas. There's 100 cities in Texas that have had professional minor league baseball, like the Marshall Browns and the Pampa Oilers and the Paris Peppers and the La Mesa Lobos, Lubbock Hubbards. And one of the things I like doing is trying to find old jerseys, but I like trying to find road jerseys, because road jerseys, they would put the city name across it versus the nickname for the home jerseys. So, and I've had a lot of fun doing that. Anything else?
We have one more question from a Zoomer.
Okay.
If you scroll down to see it.
I'd have no problem doing that. So the question is, can y'all see it? Yeah, you can see it. I'd have no problem doing that. I have a lot of items, and I know for a fact my wife would like to get some of them get out of the house for a while. So, but yeah, I'd be open to it if we can make it work. I do know there was a gentleman, I can't think of his name, that actually wanted a more permanent display at the Museum of Science and History, the Fort Worth part of it. And it just has never happened. I mean, a lot of things get in that way, but I think long term, that would be a fun goal. And for those that don't know, and I don't think it's big enough, but down in Waco, they have the Texas Sports Hall of Fame. As you can imagine, being in Texas, there's a lot of focus on football. But I would like to see them grow their Texas baseball, and I'd be glad to help if they would call. So.
Someone would like to know where they can find more information about the Marshall Browns.
So I know, no, I love it. I'll only tell you is if you share me with your, no, I'm just joking. So the best, so these teams, the heyday of minor league baseball was in the late 30s, 40s, and 50s. So and I would say the Marshall Browns, and I don't have my chart with me, I think they played in the East Texas League from 1949 to like 1953. So the best way to do that is to contact that local library in Marshall, and hopefully you'll find their version of Max Hill and help them do research through the microfilm. All these cities would obviously have a newspaper, and a lot of them were captured on microfilm, microfiche, whatever. And if you could do that, you'll find, I have found more information about a lot of things. There's one of the fun things I found is there's a barnstorming team called the House of David. They were very Christian, they wore these long beards, and they were touring the country. Well, they played here in Fort Worth like 6 times. And seeing their pictures and who they played. Babe Ruth played here in Fort Worth. By the way, I didn't even mention any of that. Fort Worth was used as so when the major league teams a lot of times would spring train in the south because the weather's nicer. Some of them Waxahachie, I mean, for a while there, Texas was home to some of these. Well, they would barnstorm their way home, meaning if they were in Florida or whatever, they would take trains and they would stop in Birmingham and play a game, an exhibition game. They would stop in Fort Worth and play an exhibition game as they worked their way back up to their home, wherever that was. And so we've had at one time, I think we were able to document about 50 Hall of Famers that have actually played at the site at LaGrave Field. And at one time, there's a big plaque that showed that. Yes, sir. Say again?
Jim Thorpe, did he play exhibition?
I've never seen that documented. It doesn't mean he didn't, but I've not seen that documented. Anything else? No more questions here. So, where were we? Yes, ma'am.
What happened to the plaque with the Hall of Famers?
That's a great question.
It was there for a while.
It may still be there. I just, I don't, well, as y'all know, the field has faced some major degradation. And it's sad to see the extent of it right now. It's been tagged 1,000 times. People have gone in and stolen all the bleachers outside because of aluminum pricing. And we've tried to, just to know how sorry some people can be, they started hitting the stadium when this old group I kind of represented actually still owned it. We welded 2 doors shut so that they couldn't get in and steal copper out of the electricity. They broke the welds. They had to beat on them for hours to do that. And they broke all the welds and got in and did it anyway. So it's tough. It needs to be used.
The plaque was still there a year or 2 after that.
I can't tell you if it's still there or not. So the white jersey on your right was the last professional jersey that Bobby Bragan wore. And if y'all remember, back when the Cats were playing, he managed a team and now is the oldest manager to actually manage a professional team. Got thrown out in the 5th inning purposely so he could go sit up in the press box. This other jersey is from 1954, and the only thing I would implore you to do is reach up and grab it because it's wool. This is what they played in until probably the 70s. And feel that wool, and you're like, I can't believe that they're playing in Galveston, Texas in this wool, much less Fort Worth. That program, I have a game program from 1929. There's a KFJZ fan that was given out at a game in the 20s. There's a ticket stub from 1910 that J. Walter Morris gave out when he bought the team and took it to the north side. The glove is from another old Cat that used to hang around for a while named Eldon Hill, the catcher's mitt. The cap, we don't know who it exactly belonged to, but it is a real cap from that early 50s. And then there's a bat from Clarence Craft Motors that they gave out in the 20s. And then the last thing is there's a silver plaque that was given to Mrs. Paul LeGrave for lifetime access to ball games.